Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and start. We're still expecting some more people. I understand that they're lighting the Christmas tree today, which is slowing some people down. Not if you came by mass transit, though. Appropriate, I suppose, to tonight's program. My name is Scott Kratz. I'm the Vice President for Education here at the National Building Museum. And tonight's program is coyly entitled Divorce Your Car, which is the 12th in our series called For the Greener Good, Conversations That Can Change the World. The goal of this series is to bring together the world's leading experts from different disciplines to discuss sustainability and the built environment. This evening's program will examine what will it take to get Americans out of their cars. Serendipitous timing, as the heads of the big three automakers are in Washington, D.C. this week, I suppose. Tonight, we will ask how we can design neighborhoods that are more walkable and encourage mass transit. Cars sit unused for 90% of their lives. Is there a more efficient way for people to use these automobiles? Can we plan cities for people instead of cars? We've assembled an impressive panel this evening representing a wide range of viewpoints and experiences, and I look forward to an interesting discussion. And given the themes of this series, I would encourage everyone to visit, if you have not already, the new exhibition, Green Community, which just opened up last month, a month and a half ago. Green Community explores the past, present, and future of sustainable towns and cities from across the globe. And the show is open through October 2009. Programs such as tonight have been designed to incorporate your questions and thoughts. They are meant to be conversational in format. We will break periodically during the program to take questions from the audience. And I have to thank our funders as well, because we could not do these programs without the generosity of our funders. The For the Greener Good series is presented by the museum's sustainability partner, the Home Depot Foundation, and we would like to thank them for their generous support of this innovative lecture series. If you like what you hear tonight, we encourage you to come to our next For the Greener Good program in the series. On January 27th, we will present a sustainability roundtable, is what we're calling it. And we've invited leading editors and journalists to discuss the future of green. The panel will include Robert Ivy, the editor-in-chief of Architectural Record, Dennis Dimmick, the executive editor of the National Geographic magazine, Anthony Fiola, a journalist at the Washington Post, and Susan Piedmont Palladino, who's a curator here at the museum and the curator of the Green Community exhibition, will moderate. So that should be a good one. Please mark it on your calendars. Before we begin, it's helpful for those up on stage to get an idea of who they are speaking to. So can I ask just to raise your hands for architects that are in the audience? Great. Planners? Wonderful. I think the planners outnumber the architects. Landscape architects? Great. Engineers? Journalists? Students? Great. Federal or state employees? Boy, that's wonderful. That's great. With that, I would like to introduce our moderator, who in turn will introduce our distinguished panel this evening. Juliet Eilperin is a journalist at the Washington Post, where since April of 2004, she's covered the environment for the National Desk, reporting on science, policy, and politics in areas including climate change, oceans, and air quality. She joined the Post in March of 1998 as its House of Representatives reporter, where she covered the impeachment of Bill Clinton, lobbying, legislation, and 5 national congressional campaigns. She is an author of Fight Club Politics, How Partisanship is Poisoning the House of Representatives, and has a new book on sharks to be published in the spring of 2009? In 2010. She did a wonderful job moderating the program this time last year as part of the For the Greener Good series as well. Please welcome Juliet Eilperin.
All right. Actually, if it's okay, I'm just going to sit here as I introduce our great panel that we have. And the easy opening question is I'm going to ask them to talk a little about what they do now and how it informs their perspective on this question of how to divorce one's car. So we're going to start with Robin Chase, co-founder of Zipcar and founder and CEO of GoLoco. Then Bert Gregory, who's president and CEO of Mithun Architects Designers Planners in Seattle. And Shelley Poticha, who's president and CEO of Reconnecting America and divides her time between Oakland and DC. So Robin, if you could start, and then we'll go on to Bert and Shelley.
When I founded Zipcar and when I was doing Zipcar, what I realized is the world revolves around transportation. Who knew that was the center of the universe? but it really struck me how urban development patterns and mixed use is what really informed where we could put the cars and not put the cars, and where it worked and didn't work. So Zipcar and car sharing only works in places where you don't need a car to get to work. So that meant that we were, the foundation is in dense urban areas and in university towns where people don't use cars to get to work or school. What I realized and why I started my next company, GoLoco, which is an online ride-sharing community, was that what about all those people who are car dependent? What can we do for them? And that was where, and we'll talk about this at some point, is what do we offer to those people who live in car dependent locations, that we're not going to be building out subways or transit or anything out to these places that are far away because the community is too sparse. So these are issues that I grapple with a lot. How can we think? The other piece that informs is the cost of car ownership in people's lives, and how can we make that a lighter load. And so we can think of solutions for the urban areas and what are the solutions for the rural ones. And they're both spending on average $8,000 a year.
Great. And Bert.
Well, I was at a great dinner about 2 years ago with a client, and at the end of the dinner we gathered around and had port and great dessert, a wonderful, really wonderful dinner. And the client asked all of us at the table about what gives us hope. And that was a great question. And Paul Hawken was at the table, and Paul Hawken said that his hope was in the realization that individuals started to understand that they were connected to a global system. That was a beautiful thing, and really about the change that's occurring, that's come about through this awareness that we are, in fact, interconnected with nature and interconnected together throughout the planet. When it came to me, I said, well, my hope is in cities and integrated design. And that I felt as an architect and urban designer that those were the two fundamentals that we needed to work on in order to create beautiful places for people, well integrated with nature. And so my perspective is really about how do we build great cities.
Well, hope has a whole new set of meanings now. Well, I'm fundamentally an urbanist, and I'm a big culture maven. I just love the vitality of cities and the people within them. And that really has spurred me to think about how can we do better in our communities. And I practiced as an urban designer for about 20 years and decided that really at heart I was an activist. And I went into the nonprofit world and for many years ran an organization that was trying to put forward a really new model for how we grow our cities, the Congress for the New Urbanism. And from that, felt that we really need to take on a really complex set of strategies that are much deeper than about urban design alone, but also making places that culture can really happen in a really deep way. And I came to Reconnecting America, and I'm focusing at all different scales to look at how people live their lives in ways where they don't have to drive for every single trip. And how can that be not just a chore, but a delight and something that people really get energy from? So that's kind of the overview, I'd say.
Excellent. And we're definitely, obviously, there's a lot there for discussion, and I think a little later we are going to get in also this tension between cities and suburbia, and how do you have different policy solutions for both. But I thought maybe we could start, given that everyone I'm sure would agree we are in this transformational moment in American politics, and talk about how, with the election of Barack Obama, both what opportunities do you think it presents for, again, changing the way we spend our transit dollars, prioritizing things on the state and local level, as well as what are the fundamental obstacles that will you know, that show that perhaps his election is not a panacea in terms of answering some of these tough questions. So whoever wants to jump in.
Well, I think that at the same time that Barack Obama has been elected, there's also just this enormous alignment of stars that there's just been this rush of interest in our impact on climate. There's been a demographic shift in the United States that's created a real estate market that's about much more about cities and urbanizing suburbs. And people are beginning to recognize that they could live in different ways and be happy and prosperous. And the election, I think, kind of pushed forward this sense of optimism and also the confidence that maybe we could do some things differently. So I'm the co-chair of a national campaign called Transportation for America, and it is trying to put forward this notion that our transportation investments should help people's lives, and it should help our economies, and it should help our environment, not just be investments for investment's sake. And I think that the people that I've been talking to are just much more interested in trying something new than I would have ever thought of even 6 months ago.
I would concur with that. In the real estate industry, I work in about half my work in government, higher education, institutional work, and the other half, I used to work with developers. They are, most of them are out there trying to improve their golf game right now. But certainly the issues about the transformation of the attitude of the private sector is really quite exciting and quite robust. And I'd say that the switch turned about 9 months ago, where the institutional investors and the large-scale real estate corporations recognized that the winds had changed and that they needed to change also. And that's a very exciting time because that's the market. And so as the market gets prepared for the receipt of this demand that's being emerging, I think we are really at a very exciting time. A knowledge base is increasing. The time that we're in where the silos still exist, but there's at least an understanding that perhaps there's synergies that can occur between the silos, both at the government institutional level, that there's a lot of exciting things that are happening. And so I see this as a very promising time. We are caught between the old economy and the new economy. And we're, as a practice, very busy working on projects for the new economy. So if we get some structural policy issues changed, I think it's not going to take much to really be a very exciting future.
Building on the things that you said, that this is a propitious moment, and I look at the economy and this idea that we want to create jobs by building infrastructure, and I think, wow, now there's the opportunity we've been waiting for 20 years to build out this transportation infrastructure. And the question, of course, is which transportation infrastructure? Yes. And one of the things I was talking with Juliet about just the moment ago, so we've been talking about the positive things. For me, the incredibly negative thing is that if we don't fix energy prices, and it's specifically gas prices, you can build it, but they won't come. And I live in Boston, and work that we've done there, I feel like if I'm living in my suburban town, if it's cheaper and faster for me to take my car, you can have that brand new subway there, and I'm still taking my car because it's cheaper and faster. So I look aghast at the sheer joy. We're saying, the Obama administration is saying, we're going to do green energy and green infrastructure, and we're going to push these green things, and I say, yes, 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 but if we don't fix the energy price, we're going to put those billions of dollars to what end? Because we are all clever, and we choose the simplest, easiest, cheapest way to go.
And I was hoping, and maybe Bert, you could lead us off, to give people a vision of what we're talking about and kind of the change to which we're heading towards. I guess if you could talk a little about the work you've been doing in terms of LEED certification for communities, and kind of how is it that you first of all are able to measure, you know, exactly what is greener and not greener when you're doing this? And again, maybe, you know, then you know, Shelley and Robin can follow up about, you know, what are kind of real ways in which you see a change in how people live, whether it's, again, in a city or in a suburbs, which actually begins to have meaningful impact as opposed to kind of very isolated, small changes.
Well, I think it's a good question. It ties to this very exciting time that we live in, and this convergence. And it's the convergence of all these issues into a new attitude and a new way. Now, it's not to say that that's going to happen fast enough or at the pace we would hope, but it certainly is happening. And the LEED for Neighborhood Development program, which has been under development for about 4 years and actually is in its final public comment period. You can go to usgbc.org, LEED-ND, and download it, and then send back a whole bunch of comments, and we actually read them, surprisingly. As vice chair, co-vice chair of that committee, we see it as a market transformation of the patterns of growth that have occurred in the United States. And obviously we're all talking about the modification from sprawl to more efficient, effective, and lower cost strategies for how we spend our public dollars. LEED-ND focuses principally and is really about location first, meaning that smart locations are really principal. Infill, connected to transit with transit-based opportunities, protecting nature, obviously, and then building neighborhoods that are walkable, that are compact, that are complete, meaning the kinds of uses and facilities that we would all want within a walking distance, and connected, meaning that you can get from here to there without a car. So that's the fundamental of the LEED-ND program, which is trying to describe that in a manner that reduces carbon, is energy efficient, water efficient, looks at the neighborhood as an integrated system as opposed to isolated elements. And we hope that that will help transform market-based real estate as we move into this century, and it's a very exciting thing that we're doing.
And Robin, can you talk about like how ride sharing operates, you know, and you know, what's different about it, and kind of how you make it more systematic and easier for people to connect to people, and then Shelley, if you can talk about what Reconnecting America is doing on that front as well.
The principle of ride sharing is that we own our own cars, we drive them 2 out of 24 hours in a day. What an incredible waste that you've bought this entire asset of your car. So it's about $8,000 on average in the US, and in Washington, D.C., it's $10,000 a year on average people spend. That the cost-benefit relationship when you're in a dense urban area, or 80% of your trips can be walkable, it's not worth owning a car. So car sharing, the principle is someone else holds the asset, which is the company, and people are just buying what they want. They're just paying for what they use. So you could make the reservation by the hour or for days, and you make that reservation for a very specific car in a specific location. What's key and transforming about it is that these cars are parked very distributed throughout neighborhoods. So I personally have my own cars that feel like my cars, and we went to some effort to name them so that it's not, you know, go get GL367, but go get Mini Mia or Element Enzo or Peter Prius, and those feel like my cars, and so I don't trash those cars or treat them poorly, because that is my car in my neighborhood, and I have a relationship with that car. It's a transforming thought that I'd like to see built throughout more of our society, which is to say we need to move from an ownership society to a rental, or just paying for what I use and just acquiring what I use, and that's a very nice attribute out of it. One of the things I'd love to see in the LEED-ND is communal parking spaces, and parking spaces that don't have restricted access, because those are the spaces in which shared vehicles can be placed, because you want ultimately everyone to be sharing cars, and not everyone should. So just give the last number, Zipcar today has, I think, 300,000 members sharing 5,500 cars parked in 5,500 parking spaces. That's as opposed to the norm in America, which is not quite fair because we're talking about people in cities, but the norm in America is 1.1 cars per people. So 300,000 people would have 330,000 cars, and those people are now car satisfied with 5,500 cars. So it's a dramatic difference. And the last piece around car sharing that is so compelling is that when I drive a car, when you own your own car, you're thinking to yourself, I'd like some ice cream. You get in the car, you drive and get some ice cream because you're thinking it's just the cost of gas, 27 cents to go get the ice cream. When you're using a shared car, you're thinking, I'd like some ice cream. That'll be $8.50. I'll have some cookies. Or I'll buy the ice cream on my way home. So it really changes. The most dramatic change is not the type of car, but the fact that you have to rationalize which is the best mode for every single trip, which is why I keep harping back on this cost piece. Do I want to go by car, by subway, by bike, by foot? And when the economics of that choice is lined up, you can choose the best mode for your particular errand.
Well, I'd like to point out, you asked earlier, what are some of the indicators that people are looking for something different?
Right.
And I just saw some statistics today that show that even in the last month, while gas prices have been going down, transit ridership nationally has gone up about 8%. And that's been the trend for the last year, basically. So there's just been this big movement toward transit ridership. The other thing that we're finding is that in cities across the country, bike riding is growing in the double digits. So I'm hearing between 20 to 35% growth in bike ridership in communities across the country. So part of what we do at Reconnecting America, we host something called the Center for Transit-Oriented Development, is help pull together the information that makes it convincing to people who are perhaps nervous about building in ways that give people the opportunity to walk and bike and take transit to get around, to understand that there is a growing segment of our population that's seeking this out, and that we ought to look at the way that we invest public sector dollars and motivate the marketplace or set the rules for development so that this market can indeed be satisfied. A couple of years ago, we did a study of the demand for housing within walking distance of transit in the United States. And we looked at who lives near transit today and how those segments of the population are likely to grow into the future. And purely based on demographic changes, we're likely to see about a third of the housing market want to be living in places where walking, biking, and transit is possible, these sort of walkable neighborhoods.
And how does that compare to where we are now?
Right now, we are delivering maybe, I'd say, under 10%. So we've got a big demand, very little supply,
Right.
and one of the things that we really have to work on is maximizing supply.
Right. Excellent. Well, I'm sure there are many excellent questions from the audience that we could take. So while I have plenty of questions up here, I thought we'd see whether there are a couple of questions we could take from the audience right now, if there are. There we go.
So what's the advantage of car share over a taxi cab ride? It seems like when I've seen the prices for the car, you're just taking out the car for an errand or for an hour or something like that. The taxi cab would be cheaper. So do you think there are advantages over the cab?
I believe in diversity of transportation options because there really is a different reason for those different things. If you want to go one way, you should be taking a cab. If you want to go to a place where it costs a lot to park, $20 an hour to park, you don't want to be using a shared car for that, so you definitely want to be going by cab. If you want to be going to a place that's far outside of the city or for multiple days, you're going to be using a shared car. So it really depends where you're going and the purpose of your trip.
another question?
Do you think Barack Obama is going to have the guts to do what has not been done in years and years, is to make a gas tax, increase the gas tax so that we are comparable to Europe, or is he just another politician?
Does anyone here know Barack Obama and can introduce me so I can tell him what the right answer to that question is? That's what I would like to know. I just wrote...
Tell him your idea.
So there was this interesting thing that just occurred to me. If we have what occurred to me is if we have a cap and trade or a cap and trade tax, what's very interesting is that dollar per ton, when it's applied in the energy sector, will change behaviors, but that dollar divided out per gallon will be about 8 cents a gallon, and will have like nothing to do, will have no impact on your driving behavior. So I would propose, in addition to the cap and trade that looks more and more inevitable, and I'm happy to hear that we have to do something that makes us comparable with other countries in terms of our energy, of our fossil fuel prices. So we need to have a floor, and I'd like to see that floor actually rising over time. And one of the interesting things is we have these 3 automakers sitting in Washington today, is we keep talking about how they were such jerks, they didn't do anything innovative, why didn't they make fuel-efficient cars, they're such dummies. And I think, well, they were such dummies, they were following the market that we Americans were asking. And I did some research on this, and the Toyota's Prius, which they put on the market in 2000, in the 8 years that car's been on the market, 35% of Priuses have been sold in Japan to satisfy their domestic market. And if you think of the size of Japan compared to the size of the US, they really built and designed a car to fulfill their domestic market, which has a gas price that's 2.5 times ours. And if we want our American cars to be sold any place other than here, we need to create this gas tax floor so that we're competitive and our cars will be sold elsewhere. That's my advice, Mr. Obama.
But it seems to me that there are, I mean, in addition, there are probably a whole bunch of other ways that we could begin to adjust the price of driving. So, you know, many of you are probably familiar with the congestion pricing program in London. Where
But that's been really hard to implement in the United States, right?
It has been
to back away from it.
Although, what we might learn from the New York experience, where they tried really hard to do that, there was popular support within New York to put this forward.
And so then why do you think it failed?
Why do I think it failed? Yeah. I think that its timing was not ripe yet. They had not really done the homework to build the kind of deeper support that they needed. And there has been such a revolution in New York since the congestion pricing project went down to defeat, where, you know, biking and walking is just zoomed up.
In New York, congestion pricing is coming back on the table, and actually I think we'll be hearing that talked about this early spring, in January and February. They're going to bring it back. But an interesting, what other things can we do that doesn't have this political drama? And I was talking with another colleague. Have you guys heard about pay-as-you-drive insurance? And we have so many sunk costs with our driving that as many of those sunk costs as we can make variable, that will impact your desire to drive. And pay-as-you-drive insurance, we're not doing anything politically tricky or something that's difficult. It's saying your $1,500 that you pay in a big lump, instead of doing it in a lump, let's say that would be 10 cents a mile. People drive 15,000 miles. So to put it, and they believe that having that 10 cents a mile, doing pay-as-you-drive insurance will have will be a large and rapid behavior change. So that's something I'd love to see happen. And I don't know how you mandate that or not mandate that, but that would have a very transformative effect.
Initiative's always a good strategy.
Yeah.
You know, I think the fundamentals of climate change are driving a lot of issues. And the cap aspect of cap and trade, which ultimately is state-driven initiatives setting climate change reduction goals, which is happening all throughout the United States, with obviously Western Climate Initiative for the West Coast. You know, we have a law, and the law says that we have to reduce our per capita climate GHG production by set amounts over time by 2020 in our particular case, which will move on to 2050. And that's the law. We have no options. And what does that mean? That we have to figure out how do we do that, and what are the combined strategies, very complex combined strategies, in order to reach those goals. And you can't reach those goals without an integrated strategy that deals with land use and transportation, and obviously where energy and the type of energy that you're consuming. So I believe that if Washington State, not unlike California or other states that start to look at that self-imposed regulation that's not imposed by the federal government but by the citizens of the state, we have to decide how we're going to do that. And we have to reduce our VMT as a part and a fundamental aspect of the combined strategies to reduce GHG production. So with that, then the policy will be enacted, which will do things that will drive down VMT. And as a policy, that's our goal. So I think it's the first time in a long time where policy actually is kind of getting in the way of you know, the need to drive a single-family car, because policy is going to change land use. Policy is going to change the number of lanes that are allocated on a freeway system. Policy is going to change the fact that we will, in Washington State, actually have time of day pricing. And so in order to, we can't afford it anymore. We can't afford an 8-lane bridge, but we can afford a 4-lane bridge with 2 transit lanes and the ability to charge for peak hour use on that bridge.
Now, and by the way, while I know this is a sophisticated audience, vehicle miles traveled is VMT and GHG, greenhouse gas emissions. And also, just following up on that, though, I also want to talk about both, you know, obviously, again, we're talking about, in many cases, policy and economics, but also kind of mindset and marketing and kind of how you change culture. And one thing I found interesting is, so as I was covering the presidential election, during the primary, I primarily focused on Republicans, both in the primary and the general, but I did do some stories, particularly having to do with Democrats and environmental issues. And I was interviewing Chris Dodd, who was the only, he was the only Democrat who endorsed a carbon tax as part of his presidential platform. And I interviewed him. He happened to be in the middle of Iowa when I was talking to him, of course, because he dropped out so early that, you know, that was the place one was going to catch him. And so I was talking to him, and he was talking about how he saw the fields of corn that he could envision turning into ethanol, and he, you know, was so enthusiastic about his climate change plan, which was, you know, aggressive by, you know, political standards. And I said, well, I actually said, but, you know, so what would you say to the Iowan who commutes an hour each way to work? Are you going to tell Americans that they should be spending less time in your cars? And without missing a beat, he said, absolutely not. I would never tell anyone they can't have their hour each way commute to work. That is not something that I am willing to tell Iowans or any other Americans. And so I guess what I'm interested in is both, you know, when we talk about now people, you know, in neighborhoods talk about their walk score and things like that, if you could give a sense of, you know, where do you see the culture changing, and also what are, again, kind of more effective broad ways that Americans' mind shifts or, you know, the mindset is going to change, particularly given the fact that, frankly, politicians, while they're sometimes willing to enact policy changes, often are very reluctant to kind of challenge these attitudes in a more direct way.
Well, I think it may come down to just basic pocketbook issues. We've been looking at 2 things that are starting to align. One is, how much money are people spending by household on transportation. And what we're finding is that people who live in the exurbs, the ones that really do have to commute an hour each way or drive for every single trip because of the pattern of development, are spending on average 25% of their income on transportation. In many cases, they purchased a house that was very inexpensive, the drive till you qualify notion,
Right.
but their transportation expenditures are often more than their mortgage.
And how does that compare to, say, a city dweller who's within walking distance?
City
of
dweller who has walkable streets, walkable or good transit networks is only spending on average 9% of their income on transportation. The other thing is that we're seeing that in general, those places that have walkability and transit connectivity are they're holding their value more steadily, and the vast majority of the foreclosure crisis is happening in those drive-to-qualify suburbs. So the combined housing and transportation costs of that pattern of development are just not working.
Right. And certainly that's what we're seeing in the DC area when you look at the housing prices and what's happened in the far further.
So one of the things I'd like to ask, and maybe you have the answer, is how do we communicate that housing plus transportation package when people are choosing their place to live? Or I would say even when employers are choosing where they put their offices.
Yes.
How can we communicate that twinness? And maybe that should be part of the Neighborhood Leads program, is how you signal.
You know, transportation efficient mortgages are certainly one way to do that, in which, you know, the cost and location ultimately can afford a different kind of a house.
Have you read the transportation efficient mortgage recently? It says no more than 1 car per adult in the household. And I think, wow, that's efficient.
Groundbreaking.
It's not too efficient.
So that's been distorted from its initial concept to when it hit the streets, that's what it came out to be. And so
But we've been working with the Minnesota Realtors Association to pair up their multiple listing service entries with the transportation costs of that house purchase, so that when someone...
And so that's just in there when you pull in the entry and it says where it is and how many bedrooms it is in, and it has
average monthly transportation cost.
And where does that data come from? Is that CNT's data?
Yeah, it's the Center for Neighborhood Technologies data that we worked on with them, and they now have that for, I think, 28 regions in the country. And we're actually talking about, we were talking earlier about, you mentioned WalkScore.
Yeah.
This is a website where you can look up the walkability of your house. And we're talking about attaching that transportation expense to this WalkScore.
You know, it is a time, I think, as Shelley mentioned, is that it's a unique time with this demographic profile that we're trying to satisfy right now. And it's this big boomer situation, which, you know, is going to essentially double that age group in a very soon period of time. And then
you're talking about the millennials, the younger generation.
There's
right?
also
the kids of the boomers, or you're talking about the old
the boomers. You know,
right,
the two big demographics that are needing to be satisfied are the millennials and the boomers. Right. And those two demographics, just as Shelley said, there's this demand side of the equation. And the demand side of the equation is for urban life and quality urban life,
right.
which means moving into higher density communities. And when we start to look at the projects that we're working on, you know, the cost of the facility is directly tied to a lot of issues, and one is parking. And so trying to diminish the quantity of parking, to get those ratios down as much as the law will allow. In many communities, you can't get to where it really should be. They're demanding more parking than is really necessary. And then to truly price the parking space independent of the unit, which is another good strategy to try to minimize the single-use car, and then there's more understanding of actually the cost of that. So I think that the market is moving to walkability, you know, and the market's moving to transit-oriented development. The challenge that we have is the policy is not supporting that.
Right, and I want to ask a follow-up question, then we'll go back to the audience, but you know, so just following up on that, so by 2026, the nation's population over 65 will double to 71 million people. And so obviously, a lot of the elderly residents are going to be in suburbs. And how do you either, you know, basically, are we talking about redesigning these communities, and in what way can we redesign suburban communities to meet those needs? I always used to say my grandmother was one of the ones. My grandmother lived to 100, and she never moved to Florida. She lived in New York City for half her life, including the last 50 years of her life. And I always thought that was a great place to be an old person, because she could hop on the bus, she could walk everywhere, and really it was kind of, you know, she was never, in fact, I don't even think she ever had a driver's license in her whole life. So, you know, but I'm curious of, you know, what is going to be the capacity for existing communities to respond to the needs of these boomers, for example, and to what extent are we going to, you know, will it be kind of this huge migration into cities in a way that we might not have seen?
Well, you know, one thing is the edge city, or the suburban city that's becoming urbanized. And that is really, I think, a very, very huge trend, where, once again, responding to the demographics, including the demographic of single person living, or single mom with child, or single dad with child type living, is, you know, that's moving people back into the centers. And all throughout America, you know, the value of the infrastructure and the value of where the potential for transit is in the kind of marginal centers of these suburban communities. So I think we're seeing, especially if there are growth management policies in place, we're seeing tremendous re-urbanization starting to occur in the edge city or the suburban community, which I think will promote people actually being able to live there in that community. I don't think the aging population, there will be a certain point of age where, as we all know, if we have elderly parents, that the ability to live in a single-family home becomes challenged. What we're finding, however, is that the choice of the senior population, which has traditionally been for a suburban model, kind of out there in the lawn, you know, in the pasture kind of living, they don't want to be there. They want to be where the action is, where the culture is, where the arts are, where all the really life is, which means that the urbanization of senior living is also happening. And I think that's the exciting thing. How we rebuild suburban sprawl, that's going to be a challenge, but we have to do it around the nucleus of the developments that exist and get urbanization to occur there.
Brookings had a nice number that they put out, which was that 50% of the infrastructure we'll need by 2030 has yet to be built. And so that's where we get this opportunity to rebuild and to build it the right way. And when I've been talking to these small cities and towns that are about their zoning, which is single-family zoning and single purpose and all that stuff, one of the things I talk about is this aging of this group. And I point out that if you're going to have all these seniors living in your community, you're going to be paying for their transportation in incredibly expensive shuttle buses all around. And where do you want to be putting your tax dollars? And so if you think ahead a little bit, you're not going to want to provide that service. So start changing the infrastructure now.
You know, I think that often when we think about retrofitting the suburbs, we get this, you know, image in our head of, you know, the cul-de-sac street.
Right.
But actually, there's a lot of land resources in those big shopping centers that are dying, in those gigantic arterial streets lined with low-density commercial uses. And those, to me, are the places where we can really see as the opportunity for change. So often we kind of think, oh my God, the challenge of retrofitting the suburbs is impossible. It is challenging, but we have to look really creatively at what the land resources are, because I think that that's probably where most of the change will happen.
Now, let's go back, and I'm sure we'll have a few questions. Yep, speak
Okay, hi, I'm Rhonda. I was wondering, what can we do around here to convince the Maryland, DC, and Virginia governments to do like a regional council of governments similar to what's going on in New York with New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, so that they can work together for mass transit as opposed to all the infighting with metro funding and things of that nature. So.
Oh, well, here's what I think. You actually have this offer on the table to, from the federal government to help pay for modernization and repair of the metro system. But it's contingent on the states putting their piece in. Why is there not a transit riders movement here? I don't understand why people are not out there getting petitions signed here, there, everywhere to tell your elected leaders, we want to have this happen. There are so many people in this community who are dedicated riders, and yet, you know, if Los Angeles can have a bus riders union, it seems to me that this region could have an advocacy movement that's based on consumers of the transit, and that would really probably do a lot to change people's minds.
How do they do it in that, up in Seattle and Portland? How did they get that regionalism?
It's a good example of two different strategies, you know.
Sorry.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Portland has a more sophisticated metropolitan planning and transit interlinked strategy, and that's why it's working so well, the metro region. In Seattle, we unfortunately have, I think, I forgot the last count, it's something like 15 or 20 different transit agencies operating in the downtown streets. And so this fundamental issue of regional cooperation and collaboration versus local control is not only an issue for transportation, it's an issue for all services, including energy, water, it doesn't matter what it is. Yeah. And it's an odd thing where nature doesn't know boundaries. For some reason, policy does. And I think fundamentally what's going to happen is if you look at the inefficiencies and the cost, is that that's ultimately, hopefully, where there will be found integration and common solutions. Because these things are wildly expensive to operate. And when we are faced with limited resources, we really can't afford, ultimately, to have waste. So if we can look at strategies that eliminate waste, eliminate cost, try to secure the issue about the local control somehow, I think that that's really where we'll find some very elegant solutions. And that's true of energy. We have energy based upon regional systems and regional policies. When if we produce a gas plant or a coal plant, God forbid, out there in the middle of nowhere, by the time that energy, electrical energy, gets into your house or apartment, it's lost 2/3 of its utilization factor. If we bring that right to a neighborhood, generate it there, we can get the efficiencies up into the high 70s to 90s of the utilization. So we have to look at fundamentally different strategies about local neighborhood systems, but regional strategies that make sense. In this case, obviously regional transportation strategies make very good sense, so we should be really concentrating on that.
I've got two questions. The first is, what kind of population does it take within walking distance to support a Zipcar station?
We look at around 14,000 people per square mile. Is the density. 20 to 50 people share each individual car. Is that the answer that you're looking for?
And can you maybe put that in the context of how dense is Boston or DC or major cities?
In those realms. And so when I think about university towns that I guess don't have that density, so you need to have 20 to 50 people will support one car. But of course, you want to have more than one car because you don't want just have one, right?
The second question is, I'd appreciate it if each of you could describe the neighborhood that you live in.
I want to answer that quickly. In about 1999 or 2000, Boston was going through this, maybe it was 99, it was going through Envision 2020 Boston, and they had mapped out all of Boston, these planners, and they had the yellow was the best, and I was looking at it and I thought, I live in the best spot. Can you believe it? I'm there. I'm living in the best spot. And so I live in a dense metropolitan area. There's single families, doubles, triples, and apartment buildings all mixed in that density. I walk 5 blocks to the subway. There's many, many buses. And it is with extreme pleasure that I go to the mailbox, Xerox something, buy some milk, and, take my cat to the vet without getting in my car.
I live on Capitol Hill in Seattle, which Seattle is composed of 7 hills. So I live on a hill which is really, really easy to ride to work on my bicycle and really hard to get back. The number 49 bus is my bus, which recently increased its headway to every 15 minutes, which is like a delight for me, where it was a 30-minute headway. And so with the reorganization of the bus system, that's really helped me. Most excited about a new streetcar, which will not quite get to where my house is, but will get just about 5 blocks from where my house is. And that will be the end of the streetcar line that comes up from downtown Seattle, goes up First Hill, and then heads to Capitol Hill. I will be just a few blocks ultimately from a new light rail station, which is being constructed. So unfortunately, we're a little antiquated in the West Coast up there in the Northwest relative to systems, but we have a very large bond issue that was passed for a very extensive light rail system, and the City Council just announced a very extensive expansion of our new streetcar system. So anyway, right now it's really easy to ride to work and really hard to bike back. But I can walk very easily, about 45 minutes.
I live in Oakland, California. I live in one of the old streetcar neighborhoods of Oakland. In fact, Oakland is sort of an interesting city in that the downtown is the hub of a series of radial streets, each which used to be streetcar streets. So my neighborhood centers on a shopping street that has pretty much everything you'd need for regular daily life. A very nice grocery store, lots of delis, a art cinema that shows first-run movies, library, dry cleaners, good bookstores, and I live 1 block off of that street. And I either take my bus, the 51, which it runs every 5 or 6 minutes, and or I ride my bike to work because I work in downtown Oakland, so I'm pretty close to that. So I've organized my life in a way that, especially on the weekends, I really don't drive. I have 2 kids, so that complicates my non-driving experience. Because they want to go, you know, they have a elaborate lifestyle, but.
And I don't know whether I count, but I also, I'm a born and bred Washingtonian. I've never lived without being within walking distance of a bus stop, and since I started paying my own rent, I've never lived without being walking distance from the Metro, and I'm now 2 blocks from the Metro in Cleveland Park, which is fabulous. So, and I've never driven to work.
One of the interesting things that you said that I would like to enunciate to this audience is, I organized my life such that, and we live hopefully long lives, and at each one of those decision points, we can choose how to organize our lives. And it comes back to this piece around understanding the cost and value of transportation relative to housing. And so indeed, I think each of us has specifically and overtly chosen to organize our lives so that we don't care if it's $4 a gallon of gas, and I don't care if it's $10 a gallon of gas. Because my life is so organized.
Which is why she supports the carbon tax now.
Well, yeah.
Just joking.
But you know, we were joking in the elevator coming downstairs, like, what's your walk score? And in some ways it is fun, you know, for those of us who want to live this life, that we can. And, you know, just having sort of this device to sort of be able to get bragging rights, I guess, is also fun. But I can't imagine wanting, I mean, okay, let me just go further with this. I have elementary school children, and I have chosen to stay and live in the city. It would have been probably much less expensive for me to move out to the suburbs where the schools are much higher quality. But I don't think I would be satisfied in my life if that was the choice that we made as a family. And so we spend less on driving and more on education.
We were talking at dinner about this exact topic, that there's a whole bunch of people who can be holier than thou and say, well, you know what, I live in the city and I stuck in the city, and then there's the people who have the child and they're still thinking they're really clever, and then their child hits kindergarten or first grade and they start to weep and wail. And I think each one of us is able to do different things, and so I was able to keep my kids in public school.
Right.
And I laugh that my children are considered urban, underprivileged school children because they live in such an urban environment, and excellent, but they are fabulous young adults, not quite young teenagers, growing up. They're getting into great schools, and so we could work it out, and my value set, and over the course of their lives, it all works out. But it's definitely the challenge, I think, that we need to make cities, in addition to being walkable and bikeable and transitable, to get the education where more people are comfortable to keep their kids in the system.
You know, there's a chicken and egg thing about all this a little bit that we have to recognize. And in the existing cities, you know, we fundamentally have the density that will support the transit, you know, and for Shelley to have a 5-minute headway, which is like, geez, wouldn't that be great, you know, and you know, just getting 15-minute headway on a major urban corridor in Seattle. So as we move further out from the city center, you know, the challenges become greater. And so that's why it's really very, very important to set policy to create the density that ultimately will support these transit networks. And land use patterns, you know, how we do mixed use neighborhoods. It's not all that challenging, you know, is the streetcar neighborhood, which is what my neighborhood is too. 5 blocks is my city, you know, little city neighborhood center. Is if we look back to the pattern of development that occurred before the automobile, how American cities were developed, you know, they were developed in this streetcar neighborhood fashion. And all we need to do is just go back to the history, tune it up, get a bit more density associated with these things, and that's the fabric that we really need to create. And those neighborhoods are all across America and absolutely wonderful. When I grew up in Denver, Colorado, it was a streetcar neighborhood. Of course, you know, I was born essentially the year that the streetcar neighborhood went away. All the streetcar system, the electric trolley, was abandoned. But my neighborhood was a block from the market and the drugstore and my dentist and the plumber shop and the barber and the ice cream parlor and the candy shop and park, you know, all that stuff. It was just right there. And an apartment building. And the apartment building was where my friend's grandma lived, who lived 2 blocks away. So, you know, this aspect of mixed-use neighborhoods, high-density neighborhoods connected to transit, you know, that was the fabric of American life that somehow has disappeared over the last, you know, 75 years. And all we need to do is go back to that fundamental history of America, build on that, build on the demand side of the equation that we're talking about, and we can have some great communities.
An intriguing statistic that I learned too late in my transportation life was that only 20% of your trips are your commute to work trips. 80% are not. So when we think of these exurbia and suburban, we think, how in heck are we ever going to save those? And people don't have a lot of flexibility with their jobs. Typically, it's very sticky. But to create the density so that those 80% of the trips, okay, 50% of the trips, you can not have to get in a car, and that those we can solve much more simply. But it requires this changing in zoning and attitudes.
Well, yeah, okay, so we're on this, and this is great. I'll just get in there before you find your person. But the other thing that we're now learning is that those 80% of trips, the vast majority of them are under 3 miles in length. They are also the most polluting in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So the more that we can convert the short trips to walking, biking, transit trips, we're reducing travel demand, reducing oil consumption, and we're reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay, we've got lots of questions
Sorry.
out there. So raise your, no, it's totally fine. But let's
Hi, I'm going to be a little selfish in my question. I work on rural issues at Transportation for America. Shelley's actually my boss. And my question's a little long, so forgive me, I'm going to read it. I'm listening to you talk about how the future of America is in urban cities, and this is making me wonder 2 things, but I'm only going to ask one. It seems like rural communities will be alienated by this message, which we don't want to do. And so I just wonder, how might you suggest we engage rural Americans as a part of the planning process? People who aren't necessarily going to value more cost-effective living over wanting to live in the country.
Great question. Bert?
I'm a member of the Cascade Land Conservancy Board in the Puget Sound region. And it's a wonderful group that has a 2-fold mission, a 100-year vision to purchase $7 billion worth of working farms, working forest, open space, estuaries, in order to preserve all the stuff that we love about our region, and transfer that development to urban or rural village situations. So I think as we look at land consumption patterns in the United States, is that, you know, as we grow our neighborhood here 100 million more in just a short period of time, and we look at rural development patterns, you know, the pattern of rural development that's the 5-acre, 10-acre, 20-acre pattern, to be honest, can't be supported, I believe, indefinitely. And so we have to understand that if we're going to have interconnected natural systems that are healthy, that we can rely on those ecosystems for all the services that they have, if we're going to have food production that's local and not being imported from Chile, which probably most of our stuff is anyway, if we're going to have working forest so that we can get bio-based materials and wood products instead of petroleum-based products, you know, we're going to need to preserve all that stuff. So the rural strategy, I think, is ultimately a strategy of recognizing that those are tremendous, scarce, valuable resources that we have to protect for future generations, and try to develop a lifestyle design and pattern that can still be rural, in a rural village pattern or clustered development in some strategy that can, you know, have that lifestyle choice, but in a more responsible way, ultimately. Now, if the challenge with that, of course, is then transportation. And so as you spread that out, then you do spread the transportation issues out. And there's an inherent conflict there. But I believe that the rural village strategy, which is transferring the development rights from rare sacred farmland into clusters in soil types that are less dependent or less likely to be food-producing soils, is a pretty good strategy. If the node is large enough, then that can support some kind of transportation system. It may not be a 5-minute headway, but at least it's some kind of a headway.
One of the goals behind GoLoco, this online ride-sharing community, was to address the issues of those rural people, because if I look to 10 or 15 years in the future, I think one of the large crises is going to be rural poor, and their transportation costs, which are 25% today, are going to be 35 or 40%, and clearly that's not tenable. So what are the options for them? And if we think of ride sharing, if we can do it in a safe and consistent manner, that is that's the last mile solution, or the long tail solution. And I think of it as the private-public transportation. And I think through technology and through economics that requires us to do so, we will do much, much more ride sharing. And as I say, it can be great. It can work really well. And I feel like that's the only solution I can offer up to those guys, because we're not going to have in our control what the cost of fossil fuel is, what the cost of congestion pricing, road taxes, carbon, however that's putting kind of in. It's going to be too expensive. It's going to be too expensive for them. So we need to start accommodating through. I love the idea of these rural villages, as well as ride sharing. For me, it's the only answer I can give you.
All right, let's go to the next question.
I just attended a ULI conference not even 2 weeks ago here in DC, and all the big name developers were there, and every one of them went down the line saying, we are going to only be building from now on urban, near rail systems, and all that. And then I say, well, we don't have enough rail systems, and at the rate we're building them, we're all going to be dead by the time we fill a country full of rail systems. But isn't it true a lot of the early rail systems and streetcar suburbs that y'all mentioned were actually the streetcars themselves were built by developers to make their land valuable?
That's right.
And I'm wondering, how can we get the developers back into building rail systems to help kind of speed things up?
And can you also tell the audience what ULI is?
Well, Urban Land Institute, which is a tremendous organization. I was a member of the Urban Land Institute's Climate Change, Land Use, and Energy Task Force. And I think what you're speaking to is the fundamental shift in real estate, as well as the fundamental shift in the investment community wanting to go towards low-risk real estate. And at the moment, high-risk real estate is stuff out there at the edge. Low-risk real estate is the stuff on a rail line. And that's a big shift in real estate and real estate valuation. I recall about a year ago where I was talking to a developer who said that 5 years ago the 100% corner was at the intersection of 2 freeways, and that's too risky now. So the 100% corner is downtown next to a rail line. So it's a big shift. Now in terms, and Shelley probably will have much more articulate ways about this, but just an example of how the streetcar came back in Seattle, which gone for a long time. We fortunately moved to an electric rubber-tired trolley system, so much of our network through our city is pollution-free, running on hydroelectric power, clean energy. But we didn't have a streetcar. So a development entity in a neighborhood in South Lake Union in Seattle, under the leadership of Vulcan Development and the neighborhood Sloufan, got together, said that, wow, we're not connected well. We're in between the University of Washington and downtown. Let's see if we can get a streetcar going back on the old streetcar line. And they got together with a developer contribution, local improvement district, different funding strategies to start that first leg of the Seattle streetcar system. And that is so critical because it was done, it's successful. I ride it a lot, actually, my daughter and I, because we ride one way and then ride our bikes back. She's only 6, so she doesn't want to ride all the way. But she sees it as a really fun thing to do. And that's the first increment of a new streetcar system throughout Seattle. And that was really inspired by a development entity and a neighborhood.
And it's worth noting that the original acronym for that,
Yes.
that trolley was SLUT, and they changed it to what did they change it to?
Oh, it's known as SLUT now.
Oh, it's still known as SLUT. All right, it's still known as SLUT, but they did somehow try to change it, but it was too late. It was too late.
Yeah, it's called the Seattle Trolley, but it's affectionately known as the SLUT. Right?
Exactly.
You know, I think that there is this renegade movement happening all over the country. There are 80 cities in the Streetcar Coalition. The key to building these streetcars has been partnerships with the development community, with the private sector. Soon, I think the utilities will be part of that mix. And it came about not in a dissimilar way, because what we know from seeing these more recent streetcar projects is that they are enormous magnets for high density development. In fact, the studies of the Portland streetcar show that in the one block next to the streetcar, the zoning envelope, which is very aggressive, is filled to about 90% average. And it starts going down maybe 3 blocks out, 4 blocks out. It shows very clearly the interest in the private market, the development community, to locate, with the streetcar being an amenity that they see. And that's what drove the streetcar developers of the early 20th century. They knew that they had to provide access, and that's how they justified their investment. Now, one of the things that I think is going to be a huge challenge moving into the future is that not all places in our community that need that kind of mobility have the amount of development opportunity of these large urban revival projects. So the area that Bert is talking about is like maybe, I don't know, 10-block area or something like that.
120 acres.
120 acres, okay. But, you know, there are a lot of other neighborhoods that could really benefit from having a streetcar connected to them, but perhaps they don't have that huge amount of new development potential. So I do think that we need to really change the way government thinks about the investment that they're making in this kind of infrastructure. And, you know, one of my sort of pet peeves with the current federal transportation system and the way that it's operating is that it doesn't value private sector investment in transit particularly well. It also does not really recognize that there's a lot of interest from people who maybe have a choice about how they could get around in their community that would love to have the opportunity to be in a clean, modern streetcar transportation system that probably would not use old technology. And we need to sort of come into the 21st century in the way that we actually look at these investments. So I think we're going to see more private sector investment in this, but we also have to create a receptive environment for that so that, you know, we're really building real systems. And that's, you know, getting back to the original question about, you know, this presidential election and how that might function. One of the things that is right on my radar is that the federal transportation authorization expires in 2009. It's typically done once every 6 years. This is when it's coming up. And, you know, I'd really like to see this next transportation authorization be a marker in the sand that says we're going to invest differently in the way we choose our transportation infrastructure, and it's going to be about putting these projects in service of community rather than whatever the current set of indicators are.
And I think one of the really interesting questions, obviously, is we don't have a transportation secretary, and a bunch of the candidates Obama is looking at are extremely conventional in their approach to transportation. So I think it'll be interesting to see who they.
Just a few quick comments. When I was talking to someone that they had been out to see a small town that wanted to have light rail, and he was remarking how that town should never ever have light rail. It would never support light rail. So I feel like if the big thrust is we're going to get billions of dollars to do infrastructure, there's going to be a whole bunch of places that are going to want to have that built in their backyard. That's not good investments relative to others that would be higher use. So that's one piece that concerns me, that we need to do it in a rational way. And the other is just other methods of financing has to do with taxation around those locations, and for the government that built that development, built the subway, to capture some of that through taxes in later years. And last, a quick story, and I've been racking my brain for the name of the city, but a major city in India that I just got this story, so this is true, whose name I can't remember, a major one, they put out a bid, an RFP for a subway line, to build a subway line, and they had 4 respondents. One of the respondents said, "I'll do it for free." And he won the bid, and he did it for free because he owned the development rights of where the subways are coming out. So it was 100% developer paid.
Interesting.
What was it? No.
No.
Okay, how about if we see if there are a couple more questions, and then I want our panelists to also be thinking of any other practical. We've got Norma Ray with the unionization of the bus riders over here, but which is fine. But a few more practical suggestions for folks in the audience about how to make some of these changes happen. But go ahead.
Excuse me. I was wondering about any innovative ideas to enable low and moderate income folks to take advantage of some of these great things like the ride sharing and GoLoco and also in the new transportation legislation, because obviously there's benefits that would go to people, but there's often an issue of access to information about them, or in so many cities now, places like Northern Virginia, where low to moderate income people can't afford to live near the metro stop, so they often have this long, torturous bus ride just to get to the metro. So I'm just wondering what kind of innovative strategies and things that y'all have thought about with that.
Well, around ride-sharing, what's interesting when I was doing my research is that the largest ride-sharing segment market in the U.S. is Hispanics. They do like 5 times the rate of ride-sharing than others, and I'd say 2 things. 1, they don't have the income, and 2, they're way smarter about it than the other guys who are continuing to go by themselves. So I feel like it's cultural. I mean, people could be using these systems today. A friend who does low-income housing was pointing out to me, and I feel like this is the big policy issues, that what's the hierarchy of a low-income person's, where's the first dollar go? The first dollar is your blasted car, because the car gives the job gives the food.
Right.
And it is heartbreaking that the first thing is cars, and that's why I look at mixed income, how, every single time we do any zoning, we need to demand low-income housing built as a % of whatever development happens. We have to build it into these cities. We're having this urbanization. We have to build it in. And to have the car be the top of the whole pyramid is catastrophic and disgusting. For the ride-sharing piece, there's also, again, no reason why they can't. And it's always been intriguing to me that, in fact, low-income people are less likely to do car sharing. And I think it has to do with I have to be very careful here that I don't make people irritated with me in some way. I used to think it was internet access, and I think that's less so the case. I think it has to do with your personal ego tied up with the car that you own. and that higher educated people are able to parse the finance from the my car is my status. But there's no reason why they can't be car sharing.
You know, I'd say, you know, policy issues around affordability and density are obviously complex issues, and it not only goes to housing, but it also goes to businesses.
Yeah.
So we have to recognize that there are many strategies to try to allow affordability of living or workplace linked to the transit. And one strategy is incentivized zoning. If the demand side of the equation establishes enough of a value for that neighborhood, where an incentive-based strategy, meaning that you get more square footage, of which a percentage of that is allocated to affordable housing, makes a lot of sense. If the neighborhood demographics are such that it's almost impossible actually to make any housing work economically because of the land value, the rent rates, whatever, loading additional affordability requirements on that can actually stop the housing from where it goes. So I think it's a combined strategy. As a societal goal, we recognize that affordability is critical, or we should, and that should be a broader aspect of what society supports, meaning providing housing for people who can't afford that. It's more complex now because workforce housing is ultimately the new horizon in highly dense transit-oriented locations. And so looking at strategies to support that is really a huge frontier that we have to work on. But this is more comprehensive policy issues, supporting it through tax strategies, obviously incentives, other things to make that happen.
What if we prioritized our low-income housing tax credits that are one of the main financing tools that are used to build affordable housing, so that the places that got the most credits were those that were in walking distance of transit? What if HUD came back and said, we're not going to let expiring Section 8 and Section 202 housing, these are permanently affordable housing units that are now within 5 years about to go back onto the market. What if we said those that are within walking distance, which are 65% of all the units, are the priority locations for preserving those housing units? What if we actually created a revenue stream so that low-income households could get free transit passes? We're doing that in the Bay Area now. One of the revenues uses from the congestion pricing program in London allows seniors and low-income households to have free transit passes. We're also in the Bay Area having a pilot program to provide a transit pass for new apartment buildings that are within walking distance of transit. So I think that there are a lot of things that we could do, and it's really incumbent upon us to do it because we have a lot of demand and not very much supply, and that is just going to drive the price up.
Okay, and so we're basically out of time, but I wanted to see, do any of the three of you want to say, are there any other specific practical things you think that folks here can do, either in terms of how they try to influence policymakers or their own lives, that will help shift the balance that we've been talking about?
Well, one thing I would say is for each of you to understand what your carbon footprint is. And so there are many sites that you can go to estimate what your footprint is. Carbon Trust out of Oregon is a pretty good one. There are many different sites. And calculate what your footprint is, and you'll find that transportation is a very big part of it. You know, for me, actually, in our business, air travel is our largest footprint. But the automobile has a huge component of your carbon footprint. And if we think about the future in which we have a carbon-constrained world, every metric ton that you're producing is going to get ever more expensive. And if we get up real high and take a look at a world where currently about a 15 terawatt consumption of energy with assumptions that by 2020 or 2030 it could be up to 30 terawatts consumption of energy. The little momentary blip we have in gas prices is truly a momentary blip because we do not have enough energy to fuel the world. And we have to do something about that. The sun, at a 10% efficiency factor globally, will produce about 60 terawatts of energy. So when we look at what the cost of energy is going to be in the future, it's going to be staggering. And so being prepared today to develop compact, complete, walkable communities that are connected by transit is really critical. So look at your score and try to figure out what can you do to help lower that total carbon output. And I think you'll find transportation will be a big one.
And Robin and
I think I would recommend a talk I just heard from a colleague named Saul Griffith, who does something called Wattzon, so W-A-T-T-Z-O-N. And what I thought was brilliant is he has the carbon calculator, and his brilliant touch was to say, here is your share of the U.S. government's carbon footprint. And it was a brilliant moment because I want to tell you, yes, act locally, look at your own footprint, and B, we have to express to our political leaders, we're game, do what it takes, we won't fire you for it. And for me, that is the number one, after you've hit your own carbon footprint, to do, is to tell your political leaders you won't fire them for doing the right thing. For God's sake, do the right thing.
And we'll put these web addresses, these will be up on the website later on. So if you can't scribble it down, it'll be accessible if you go back to the Building Museum's website.
Well, I was going to say, get active. Make your voice heard. You know, don't be the silent majority.
There you go. Excellent, and I think that's a great note to end on. If everyone could join me in thanking just a fabulous